Alright, so I'm back once again, and as is tradition, I have a Nikon camera with me. This is one of the older ones. This is a Nikon S. I have a 50mm f2 lens on it. And I'm not going to go into the whole history of Nikon production, but this is essentially the first camera Nikon made that was truly mass-produced and was really sold outside of Japan and was thus commercially successful. So for most intents and purposes, I would say this is the first true Nikon camera. I know that's kind of divisive, but again, I don't want to really go into the whole history of Nikon and how they became a camera company. It's a pretty interesting story if you want to look it up, but that's a video for another day. So this is a pretty interesting camera. It obviously takes a lot of inspiration in its looks from the pre-war German Contax cameras. Like it's kind of in between a Contax 1 and a Contax 2. But the shutter, it uses the Leica Barnick style shutter that's fabric and it swipes from side to side instead of up and down like the Carl Zeiss Contax shutters. It's kind of interesting because I think they found a nice focal point where it's kind of the best of both worlds in a lot of ways. They made these cameras, they've got a pretty good viewfinder. It's a little narrow, but it does have a very high contrast patch on it. That's one thing you'll find. A lot of people like the S1 and the S2 because their viewfinder patches are a lot more contrasty than the S3 or 4. Arguably more so than the SP, but I think it kind of depends. The downside is that you basically only have a 50mm frame line in here, which is a little bit annoying because a lot of times you want to use another lens, but we'll get to that in a minute. If we look at the top, you'll see it's actually kind of different from the other Nikon cameras. It does not have a film advance lever. It has a knob, kind of like, again, like the old pre-war early Leicas and Contaxes. It does have more or less the same sort of shutter right here and the little shutter cuff on it. It has the old film advance lever that's separate up here, again very much like a Leica, whereas the later Nikons have a little cuff kind of built around the shutter release. It also has the sort of, I guess what you call a double layered shutter speed knob where you have the slow speeds are on the bottom and the faster ones are on the top, and you have to kind of adjust. If you want to use the slow speeds, you pretty much have to prep the camera. You flip it over here to the 20. It's kind of hard to do this. Let's see. You flip it here to that red 20 with the eye, and then you select whichever slower speed you want. Which is kind of complicated, as you can just see when I tried that. Not exactly the most intuitive thing in the world. But at the time, I guess it worked. That's what they did. That's how all the Leicas were built, so I'm guessing they just kind of copied that style mechanism. I'm glad they moved on from that. That's one thing I don't love. They also have the old style film advance knob where it's just a knob and it doesn't have the little pop out lever. Pretty much all these things were, well, the film advance lever and the rewind knob were changed and made much more modern on the S2, but I think the S2 actually kept the same style of shutter speed selector. I think it went a little bit faster. On this one, the S is the fastest shutter speed you have is 1/500th of a second, where I'm pretty sure the S2s go up to 1,000th of a second, so they are a little bit faster. Another thing is you'll see, if you look carefully at the shutter speeds, it has the old, early Leica shutter speeds where you have 1/40th of a second instead of 1/30. Well, no, you have 1/30th of a second, 1/40th, and 1/60th, which is kind of odd. 100th instead of 1/25th, 200 instead of 2/50th. A little odd. I don't know exactly why they went with those shutter speeds and why they changed over time. I guess it just has something to do with the internal camera mechanisms, but I know that was pretty common on a lot of older cameras. The early Leicas, these early Nikons, and the Soviet cameras pretty much all went with that convention. Again, I don't really know why, but it is kind of interesting. These cameras are very well built. It's pretty heavy compared to the other ones. You'll notice it also has double, I forget what you call these things, these little knobs on the bottom to release it. So it's got a very solidly built bottom and it stays on very well. I did have the shutter replaced on this one. When I got it, I found it very cheap at a sort of a flea market type place, and the shutter was trashed, so I was able to get it really cheap. It actually came with a 51.4, which I think I've featured in other videos. But you'll see the shutter is nice and clean. Fires, seems to be pretty accurate. I'm actually going to do another video on getting it repaired, because that was kind of an interesting endeavor right there. But that's a video for another day, once again. But all in all, I think this is a pretty interesting camera. I know a lot of people would probably shrug off these early Nikons. If you look at the other ones like the Nikon 1 and the Nikon M, they're very rare, they're very expensive, they're not things you'd really carry around and shoot. The Nikon S's, on the other hand, are pretty common, they're pretty cheap, They're very durable. A lot of them I seem to have damaged shutters just given the age, but those can be replaced, and it's not super cheap, but it's not impossibly expensive. So if you're looking for a budget Nikon option, I would say these are not a bad option. Again, the ergonomics aren't great. You have all these knobs up here, which I don't love. I don't hate them, but I don't love them. You have the kind of irregular shutter speeds and the more complicated shutter speed selection dial. Not something I particularly love. I do kind of like the look. It has a much more, almost like a old-fashioned turn of the century, what some people might call kind of a steampunk look to it. I kind of like that, but I know a lot of people won't because it does slow you down. It is a little bit more complicated, but I don't know. I find the camera kind of charming. It's got a very nice look. It's not exactly sleek, but it does have a certain charm to it. It's very well built. I wouldn't say it's my favorite camera in the lineup just because it's not super user-friendly. But you know, it's not a bad camera. My biggest complaint, I think, would be the viewfinder. You do have the nice rangefinder patch. It's really bright and easy to see, but your tunnel, you just have like a 50mm tunnel. It doesn't even have bright lines, so it's not exactly the easiest thing to use. I like a 35mm lens, I like a 28. I like to use the 85 a lot of times, and this built-in viewfinder doesn't really give you the option for that. So fortunately, Nikon thought ahead, and like most other camera companies, they created a variable viewfinder. I don't know exactly what these are called. I've heard them referred to as zoom finders, which I guess is kind of accurate. I always call them variable viewfinders or variable focal length viewfinders. And you'll see it covers 35, 50, 85. That unmarked tab right there is 105, and then 135mm lenses. So most of your early Nikon lens lengths were covered by this one viewfinder. It doesn't cover 28. There was a little adapter you could buy and pop over the front to cover 28, but unfortunately those are incredibly rare and valuable. It is a little bit quirky. It has sort of a parallax correction, which is built back here. You'll see, it's probably going to be hard to see, but there's tiny little numbers that give you ranges, and there's a little knob you turn. And you have to kind of line up this little notch right here with the approximate range at which you're shooting, and it kind of tilts the whole mechanism up and down a little bit, as you can kind of see there. It's probably not showing up very well on camera, but you'll see it kind of right here. It kind of splits and it tilts a little bit. You can kind of see it. Not showing up great on camera, but I don't know what I was expecting. But what you do is you pop this on top of your camera. Got kind of an interesting look. And then you would focus through this lower viewfinder, and then you would compose through this upper viewfinder, assuming, of course, that you set it to the proper focal length and also did the parallax correction. So again, more things to fiddle with. Not exactly the most intuitive setup in the world, but for the time that was very common. This is almost the exact same mechanism was used by Leica. I think a lot of people actually say the Nikon viewfinder is better than the Leica one. Contacts used a pretty similar one. They had a multi-barrel one that kind of spun around, and the Soviets kind of knocked off the contact style one. I think it's a pretty good viewfinder. My one complaint is when you use it at 35mm, it's not super sharp. It just, it's almost like it's just slightly out of focus. And if you just look through it by itself, you probably wouldn't notice, but when you switch over to like 50 or 85, you notice that the image quality is just a little bit sharper. I don't know exactly why that is. I don't know if mine somehow became miscalibrated or if they're all built like that. I'm not really sure, but I do find that kind of strange, and it's a bit annoying to me because, as I said, I really like a 35mm lens. You don't have the 28 frame line in here, which again is a bit annoying, but I guess at the time they did have the pop-on finder, which now is exceedingly rare. Strangely enough, the standard 28mm dedicated finder is also quite rare. I don't know why 28mm viewfinders are so rare for Nikon gear. I kind of wish they had made a few more of them, because that 28mm lens is actually a really good lens. I don't really know what else to say about this camera. It's an interesting camera. It's a nice little collector's piece. It is pretty usable if you find one in good condition. But it is a slow camera. All of these old film cameras are going to be a little bit slower. The Nikons, none of them have a built-in light meter of any kind. They don't all have incredible frame lines to help you select the exact image you want. And I think the S's and S2s are the perfect example of that, where you basically get one frame line and you have to have some sort of external finder for anything beyond 50, which is a little bit frustrating, but again, at the time, that was totally normal. That's how all the old screw mount Leicas are. That's how pretty much all the old Carl Zeiss Contax cameras are. It's how pretty much all the Soviet cameras are. They were kind of based off them. Even like the Arguses and some of the American and British made cameras are more or less in that same field. So it's just one of those weird quirks you have to get used to if you want to use these old cameras. I don't really have much else to say about it, I guess. Like I said, it's not the most amazing camera in the world. It's kind of primitive compared to later cameras like the SP and the S3. It doesn't really have any sort of, what do you call it, the little, I totally forgot the word now. The timer thing. I can't remember what you call it, but they don't have it. Not something I particularly miss, but I could understand some people would probably want that. Not too, I don't know, there's not really much else to say. It does have this really weird flash mechanism where it has plugs on the front and back, and I think it's sort of a forward and delayed flash, but I've never even seen a flash that uses that sort of double-pronged plug thing before. That's totally new to me. I think only Nikon ever used that, so that's another weird little quirk. But all in all, it's a nice little camera, very well built, very solid. You can put the Nikon lenses on it, which is probably the best part. You can put pretty much any of the lenses on it. Again, you'll probably have to use a finder with most of them, but you do have a lot of lens options. They're all very good. You got some cool finders. This is probably the most affordable camera out of the early Nikon lineup. Generally speaking, and I say generally, it's really hard to peg down a number, but I generally see these sell for... I've seen them sell for anywhere from about $175 to about $500, which is a pretty big gap, I know, but the ones on the higher end, in the $400 and $500 range, almost always note there was a recent CLA or shutter replacement, so if you do pay a lot of money for these, it should be one that's in good shape and has had some maintenance and should be in working order. The ones on the lower end, like a little over 100, most of those did seem to have shutter damage or something, so you have kind of a weird variety of prices there, largely defined by their actual working condition, which is kind of unusual. You don't really see that all too much. I guess a lot of people don't want to get these repaired because they're not a super valuable camera. I bought this one, like I said, for about 40 bucks. I spent quite a bit of money getting it repaired, but I think I did a pretty good deal because even after the repairs and everything, I could still probably sell this for about $400, and I think I'd find a buyer, and I would probably make a very small profit. Not much, but a little bit. So I would have to say that a good price for one of these in working order is probably somewhere in the $300 to $400 range. It's hard to say because you actually don't see tons of these on the market. If you look on eBay, you'll find Nikon S's, but you don't exactly find a huge selection of them. It's kind of strange. I guess as they've gotten older, a lot of people have just kind of thrown them out when they don't work, and their numbers are getting kind of dwindled down, which is sad because this was actually the second most common Nikon camera. The S2 was built in greater quantities, but the S was a very close second. And after that, the S3s and SPs were a little bit rarer, and the S4s were quite rare. M's and 1s were very rare. So it is just kind of a strange little thing, kind of the passing of the age of these cameras. But if you can find one, and it is in working condition, and I would try to get one in working condition because sadly there aren't a lot of places that will still service these cameras, and it can be kind of expensive. If you can get one in working condition, it's probably worth trying. If you can find one at a flea market like I did that costs next to nothing and has a decent lens on it, and it's still broken, it's probably worth it to buy it just for the lens. And if you're a little bit more daring, it's not impossible to find places that will repair them. So something to keep in mind. It's one of those things where it's kind of a case-sensitive basis. It kind of depends on your love for the brand, I guess, and the cameras and how much you want one and how much work you're willing to put into it. For me, like I said, I really like these cameras. The S was one of the only models I didn't have in my collection, so when I saw one, I was like, oh, I want that. And I saw it had a really bad shutter, and I was like, not sure I want that anymore. But the price was good enough, I ended up buying it and sent it out to get repaired. Can't really say I have any regrets. I'm going to have to do a whole nother video on the whole repair process, who I went to, what kind of work they did, roughly how much it cost, and how satisfied I am with the results. I'm going to do a whole nother video on that because that is a long story right there. But that is more or less my thoughts on the Nikon S. I'm going to end the video here. I don't have any shots I've actually taken on this camera because I just got it back from the CLA not too long ago. But more or less it is going to work like the other Nikon cameras. The one difference being that the actual film gate on this one is a little bit smaller. It was built a tiny bit narrower by about 1 millimeter or so. So the frames will be a little bit smaller on the Nikon S. I believe there's a little bit more of a gap between the frames, so it's a little bit easier to cut if you're doing that. But that is one difference you might notice when shooting the camera on the film, is that the actual frames will be a tiny bit narrower. They will be the same height, of course, but they will be a little bit narrower. So that's probably one thing worth noting right there. So I've rambled on about this camera for a while. Hopefully that's a little bit of information that can help you if you were considering buying one of these or trying to figure out exactly which Nikon you want. Or if you have one that's damaged and are considering getting a CLA for it, stay tuned. I'm going to do a video for that very soon. So I'm going to call it a day and tune in next time.